so here we go with part 3. The one thing that I didn't get to talk about when it came to shutdowns and layoffs was how management determines employee ability. So although seniority definitely plays a part in that, typically it's a weighted decision, so performance and ability is still going to affect who is going to be laid off. So factors that can be typically used to determine how employees have performed and who's going to be laid off. So, past experiences, has this employee performed similar tasks, similar job to what they're going to have to perform during either the layoff or the merger? Is their educational background fitting? What have their production records been? Attendance records? Again, have they been put through the disciplinary process before? Do they have a pretty positive attitude about things? What is their physical fitness? Other sorts of things that we can use to determine, how they performed. And typically the burden of proof, again, is on management within the organization to determine whether or not they're going to remain within the organization at that time. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about company mergers. So this is when one organization is typically, coming together with another one. But typically you see this happen with one larger company that's acquiring a smaller company. Right before I went back for my doctoral degree and moved to Alabama, the company that I was working for in Altoona was actually acquired by a competitor. And the competitor was a larger company, and they were basically acquiring a smaller company. And they were acquiring it for their software and, some of the intellectual property that they had at that particular time. And both organizations were non-unionized, but they still had to figure out how they were going to combine the employees that they had at both locations. The larger company had a marketing office, they had human resources, they had an office that specifically wrote proposals, so they were doing a lot of government type of work. When they were acquiring the smaller company actually had those support offices as well. And so it was sort of a difficult scenario to figure out who was going to be maintained as an employee and who was going to be laid off and who was going to lose their job. It was right around the time that I was leaving. I was still keeping in contact with a lot of my friends that still worked there. But every day was pretty anxious for them. There was a lot of, uncertainty as to what was happening and who was going to remain at the organization. So it was a very difficult time. Even though I had left, I still felt very, very bad for the employees that were sort of going through that. So that, those ideas of mergers and acquisitions are very, very challenging aspects. And, it's certainly very challenging when it's a non-unionized environment. Sometimes it's even more challenging when it's a unionized environment. Because when we think about dealing with things in terms of seniority, how do we combine those seniority lists? And there's a lot of different ways that we can potentially do that. Basically, the surviving, if you look at the surviving group principle, that is basically sort of a very difficult way to combine the seniority lists. And it basically means that the seniority lists are merged where everybody that is from the acquiring company, typically that's the larger company, is the first on the seniority list, and then everybody that is on the acquired company, typically the smaller company, is at the bottom of the seniority list. So it doesn't necessarily mean that that list is combined on the days that they have worked at either of those organizations. The acquiring company wants to maintain the power, and so they want to maintain their employees, so they put them up on the higher on the seniority list. As opposed to the length of service principle, which is basically combining everybody with the days that they have served in that organization. And those are typically the two main ways that we see seniority lists combined. There's a couple other ones that we see, but those first two, surviving group and length of service, are the typical ones that we see in terms of mergers and acquisitions. So what happens when we subcontract or outsource? You guys have probably heard of those terms before. This is basically an arrangement that the employer makes to basically have a portion of their business accomplished by somebody else. So, they subcontract work, they subcontract the technical aspect or customer service or manufacturing, and they could potentially outsource a portion of that work to make it more efficient or to keep down costs within the organization. So when we talk about subcontracting or outsourcing, typically this is something, again, when it comes to job security, that is really important for employees to understand their rights here. When it comes to outsourcing, maybe a specific bargaining unit and giving that work to non-unionized employees, sometimes even within a different location or even globally at times, that is an aspect that is a mandatory bargaining item. So when and again, all of this stuff that goes with job security and seniority, if the union wants to bring it up and they want to protect the jobs of the employees at that location and within that bargaining unit, they have every right to do so, and management has to discuss that. Typically, like I said, you might see these clauses that are written into contracts that protect the life of the contract to say that we're not going to subcontract, we're not going to outsource, we're not going to lay off during the life of the contract. But sometimes that takes away decision-making power and strategic ability from the organization itself. So how can they decide, to make strategic business decisions for the organization that are in the best interest of the organization? Sometimes they can claim that it's an economic hardship, but still, if it's within the life of the contract, they're going to have an unfair labor practice policy, an unfair labor practice suit that is going to be filed against them if they don't uphold the life of the contract. So there's a lot of challenges that comes with this idea of job security. How much decision-making power can we leave in the hands of management versus how we need to protect the rights of employees in terms of job security. Okay, so one of the last issues that we're going to talk about within this chapter is employee alcohol and drug testing. And why are we talking about that in terms of job security? So a little bit of a historical background. President Ronald Reagan was actually the one who launched employee drug testing within the workplace. With the Drug-Free Workplace campaign, by basically the early 2000s, there was 25 million people in the United States that were tested annually for alcohol and drugs. And basically a lot of them were asked to do this either within a job applicant procedure, so if they were applying for a job within the United States, or if they had had an accident within the workplace. And the reason being is because there's a lot of statistical research that actually talks about the effect of alcohol and drugs on missing work, people that are substance abusers compared to non-substance abusers are 10 times more likely to miss work, 3.1 times more likely to be involved in an on-the-job accident, 5 times as likely to file a workers' compensation claim, and 3 times the healthcare costs and lower productivity. So we're talking about job security. This is really an important issue to talk about, and there's a handful of reasons why. There's some concerns in terms of the unions, in terms of whether or not this is an invasion of privacy, whether or not that the tests are biased or they're unreliable. So really the organization has to be able to prove that that's not the case, that they have unbiased tests and they have reliable tests, and that they're giving these alcohol and drug tests within their rights as an employer. So the National Labor Relations Board has ruled that drug testing is a mandatory subject of bargaining. Reason being is because it goes back to this idea of job security. We are able to test job applicants who are not members of the bargaining unit and not members of the union. It's a right of management. If there's an accident that happens on the job, it is also a management right to test people for alcohol and drugs and make sure that they weren't found at fault for that workplace accident. So Job screening is becoming a big thing, really making sure that we're bringing in the employees that are supposed to be there, the ones that fit in with the organization. Typically there's a huge proportion of employers that want to find everything that they can out about those employees before they hire them in the organization. So job screening is a big use of alcohol and drug testing for sure. So pre-employment testing, these are typical ways that we find drug testing used for employers. Reasonable suspicion testing is actually when somebody is suspicious of something that's happening, suspicious of somebody's behavior within the organization, and so they're probably going to go through some sort of testing procedure. Employers also use random testing, so they'll say every 6 months, we'll pull a number of random employees from the organization, randomly test. I was actually surprised that some of our local high schools were actually doing random alcohol and drug testing. I'd heard of a couple Catholic high schools around that were doing that. Typically, for post-accident testing, if something happens, somebody gets hurt within the organization, they have an on-the-job accident, before they can collect workers' compensation, before medical expenses can be paid for, they're going to be submitted to post-accident testing. And again, this is all within the bounds, within the rights of the employer to do this. Employees' attitudes toward drug testing. Random drug testing, provides some sort of suspicion for employees. Employees really don't like random drug and alcohol testing, but again, it's within the rights of management. They're more more positive towards the idea of probable cause or accident-related drug testing. If there's some on-the-job impairment, if there's some sort of suspicion that somebody is, guilty of some of those things, then they're more positively looked upon, more favorable towards that. But again, there's some issues that have to be worked out, things that have to be worked out within the contract. People have to be trained on how to do this, trained on how to notice, some of the impairment kind of things before they, submit somebody to alcohol and drug testing. They have to have good advice or, good education on that before they start pointing the finger to say that I think, this person is addicted to drugs or something within an employment environment. They have to have a valid testing procedure. What happens if there has to be some policy to know what happens when an employee refuses to be tested for alcohol and drugs. The last thing that we're talking about here is social media usage. One of the things that is we have to talk about within contracts is what happens if an employee is found to be using social media in sort of a negative way towards the organization. And what does that policy look like? Is there something that is typically written within the contract to say that employers can use things like social media? So what does an acceptable use policy look like? Are the employees going to be monitored throughout that procedure? Does the organization have the ability to stop workers from using social media? Or is that deemed that that's, their own personal right and their personal use to do so? So this is one of those instances that's really kind of still being worked out within the National Labor Relations Board. So because social media use is relatively new, within the span of unionized environments, there's some procedures that are still kind of being worked out through the National Labor Relations Board for these ideas.